Anybody want to guess where this message starts? My hands are buried, or my face is buried in my hands, and I am sobbing. But not in a big auditorium this time. This time it's in the second annual one-on-one that I had with my district superintendent. At that time it was Bob Hunley. I had been pastor of Sycamore Creek for 2 years, and things hadn't gone well. And I was sitting in Bob's office, a mess, emotionally a mess. And I told Bob, if things don't turn around this next year, I'm not sure that I have what Sycamore Creek needs. Maybe it'd be time to find somebody else to work on this. At that time, we were also in the midst of getting ready to launch Church in a Diner, but we weren't doing that from a place of strength. You see, over those first 2 years as the pastor of Sycamore Creek, we had lost about 20% of our attendance, so 1 out of every 5 people was gone. Our budget was down about $60,000 because of that loss of people. And our Church in a Diner idea of doing church somewhere out in the community, it was sort of like a Hail Mary. Like, if this didn't work, then Bob, I think it might be time for me to go somewhere else. So I sat there in his office with my hands in, covering my face, just sobbing. So today's story that I want to tell is how did I get from that place 13 years in to being here with you, the lead pastor at Sycamore Creek, and working towards this adoption that's going to happen with Asbury United Methodist Church. What's that story? This is the last week of this series that we're in. We're calling it Our Stories, and we started off the first week with looking at our Jesus stories. I shared with you my own Jesus story, how I became a follower of Jesus. And then week 2, we looked at our call stories, our ministry stories. How was I called to be a pastor? Last week, Pastor Mark Opperly was here, and he shared with you his stories as well. And then today, what I want to take a look at is, what are the ways that I have tried to not neglect continuing to meet together to spur one another on to love and good works? What's our church story? What's your church story? Now, after each of these messages, many of you have gathered with me in small groups down in the basement. And every week, it seems like that space where folks are sharing their stories with me over pizza, those have gotten more and more sacred. And so today's the last opportunity to do that. We wrap up this series, and then I won't be up here in front again. Actually, it won't even be here. It'll be at Woldemar Nature Center on July 1st when this adoption takes place. I think that Sunday is actually July 3rd. So today's the last chance that you have to gather with me over pizza and share your story with me in the basement. Now let me give you, there's actually one other chance because I'm hosting an open house at my house today from 4 to 7 p.m. And Dawn Hecker, Dawn is back there in the beautiful, what is that, like wine-colored jacket. You're going to gather here to carpool with people because it's about a 15-20 minute drive from here to the far edge of Holt. So we want to invite you to see the Arthurs and meet us in our natural habitat, our home, all right? And I was mowing frantically before it started to rain yesterday so that it would look nice for you.
I did it a day before and then you
yes,
took it over.
Yeah. Oh dear. When your son is sitting in the front row. Thank you, Lucinda, for reading those messages. 1 Peter 3:15 has been a theme verse for this whole series. Be ready to share your story and to do it with courtesy and with love. And then the passage from Hebrews, motivating one another to love and good works and not neglect meeting together. When I think about my church story, I go all the way back to when I was a little kid. A little older than yours, Matthew. It was maybe like 3 or 4, and my grandparents and my parents were part of First Church of Nazarene in Indianapolis. And my grandma White would come into the building and she would volunteer to clean the building, and she'd bring me in with her. And I remember sitting in the hallway on the floor, and I'm sitting there, and I feel like I had some trucks that I was playing with, because that's what grandmas bring with them. And I'm sitting on the floor in the hallway, and all of a sudden I hear this voice that says, "Tommy, you're being a good boy. So I went to find my grandma, and I said, Grandma, did you say something to me? And she said, no. And she, of course, steeped in the Bible, so what did she tell me? That was God speaking to you, right? She said, there's nobody else in the building, so if you heard somebody talk to you, that was God speaking to you. So my very first memories are of this, of audibly hearing God's voice as a little kid, and it being a really positive and loving message. Tommy, you're being a good boy. I think that sets the course for my entire life involvement with church, that it's a positive, loving place where people gather to hear the word of the Lord. So I told you in the first week that in elementary school, my parents got divorced. That becomes an awkward moment in a church family. And my mom ended up taking us to another church. It was a big Assemblies of God church on the north side of Indianapolis. And I got very active in youth group. I went off to Wheaton College, which is a Christian liberal arts school in the suburbs of Chicago. And while I was there, I did something that I never had the chance to do as a teenager or as a kid. I got to choose my own church. Right? Like that was the first time I was out from under my parents' kind of decision making. And so we did something weird. I had a group of friends, and instead of going to one church, for the first 2 years of my time at Wheaton, I went to a different church every Sunday. I experienced the whole range of what the Christian tradition had to offer. I went to Reformed churches, I went to Christian Missionary Alliance churches, I went to Presbyterian churches, I went to Assemblies of God churches. Some of the more unique churches that I went to, downtown Chicago, if you ever get a chance to visit the Jesus People USA, it's a Christian commune where they all live in a big apartment building that they own together, and they share everything that they have, and they minister to the poor, and they eat together, and it was a very different experience than any church I'd ever had. Another church that we attended that we kind of settled on in some ways was a church that was a charismatic Episcopal church. Imagine all of the smells and bells and high liturgy of a church with a full rock band and a charismatic movement. It was again, something I had never experienced. I remember sitting in the pews, or it was actually an auditorium of a school. They didn't have a church building. They were kind of a new church. I remember sitting and hearing for the first time ever in my life the Nicene Creed. I had never heard that before growing up in an Assemblies of God church. And it spoke to my mind and my heart in a way. And once again, I fell apart sobbing in the seats listening to and reciting the Nicene Creed. How many of you have ever cried while you're saying the Nicene Creed or the Apostles' Creed? All right, you and me, Jalen, we're there, all right? Those speak to our hearts and our minds. I also volunteered in the projects on the south side of Chicago, and actually in the last 2 years or so of my time at Wheaton, the main thing that I did on Sunday morning was that I went down and I led Sunday school for the kids in the project. So I became something of church for kids in that time. When I graduated from college and I got married to Sarah, I moved up to Petoskey where she was at. She had been working at the Petoskey United Methodist Church as the youth director there. And I don't know if you noticed in all of those churches I mentioned that I attended while I was at college, which church didn't show up in that list? United Methodist. I had never been in a United Methodist church until I was hired at Petoskey United Methodist Church. I had no clue what Methodists were all about. And I've grown since then to deeply love that. Love the United Methodist Church. One of the kind of unique pieces, or tragic and traumatic pieces of joining the staff at Petoskey UMC at that time was that a year before I joined on staff, the senior pastor, Don Eddy, died by suicide. My wife was on staff at the time. When he died, she was then the only full-time staff person at that church in her early 20s. There was an interim pastor who was appointed, a retired pastor in the church. And then the new pastor, James Mitchum, was appointed July 1st, and I was hired in August of that same year. James, by the way, has been there ever since, and he's retiring this year. That's a long time. That's 25 years that he's been the pastor there. Everything went really well. When the church was really excited, they had these two young couples, youth director, and I was in charge of children and adult education. They had a new young pastor. For the first year, things were wonderful. But then came year 2. Year 2 is always the challenging year. And that's when everything hit the fan. And all of the past trauma, all of the past pain, not just of Don's death, but 50 years worth of pain from previous situations, all came up in year 2. At that time, we were introduced to someone who has become a mentor of mine over the years, a retired United Methodist pastor named John Savage. John is also a spiritual director. He has some psychoanalysis background. He's a musician, and he's also a specialist in corporate pain. How does pain get transferred from one generation to the next in a community corporately? And one of the things that has stuck with me ever since is a story he told. I think it's probably a parable more than a real story. But he told the story of monkeys being studied by researchers. And the researchers put monkeys in a cage, and they had a ladder that they could climb up to get a banana at the top of the cage. And the monkeys would learn very quickly to climb up the ladder and get the banana. And after they all learned how to do that, the researchers started to spray the monkeys with cold water to put pain into the situation. And slowly but surely, guess what happened to any monkey that tried to climb up the ladder? Well, the other monkeys would beat that monkey up because none of them wanted to get sprayed by cold water. Well, eventually, the researchers had so ingrained this habit into the community of monkeys that they didn't need to spray water anymore to keep the monkeys from going up the ladder. And they took one monkey out, put a new monkey in. Guess what that monkey did? Ran up the ladder to get the banana. Guess what the other monkeys did? Beat him up. Take one monkey out, put a new monkey in. Guess what that monkey does? Goes up the ladder. Guess what the other monkeys do? Beat him up. Even though that the water isn't being sprayed on them, and even though the original pain is no longer there, the behavior has been learned by the community. The behavior that saved them from the pain to begin with. Eventually, all the monkeys are new monkeys. None of them were there when the water was being sprayed on them. And they're still beating the monkey up that goes up the ladder to get the banana. That's how corporate pain is passed on from one generation to another. Even though the original hurt, the thing that caused the hurt, is no longer there, the learned behavior to protect from the hurt has been taught from one group to the next. Now, I want to teach you or show you what John Savage taught us as a church, a model that when I came to be the pastor at Sycamore Creek, this was the very first thing that I taught our leadership team and the very first thing that we taught our church. And it was what John taught us as a church, that if Sycamore Creek is healthy and thriving, if Petoskey UMC was healthy and thriving, it's because we learned this one simple thing. All right, John, would you come on up here? I need just you to be a tripod for me for a second. Just stand right here with this. This, friends, is called the role renegotiation model. And it describes how relationships work. At the beginning of any relationship, there's a gathering of information. Like if you're looking at getting to be with somebody romantically, you might go out on dates. You kind of spend time together. You gather information. But then there's a point where you make a commitment. You get engaged or you get married. And following that is a season of productivity and stability. What's that called in marriage? The honeymoon stage, right? That's year one. That's when everything is wonderful. We have a new pastor, we have a new young pastor, we have new young staff members. It's wonderful. The grass really was greener on the other side, right? But no matter how well you did at gathering information, at some point in a relationship, there's a broken expectation. And a small broken expectation is a pinch, and a big broken expectation is a crunch. And this creates a disruption of expectations. Now that hurts, right? In fact, a crunch can be a lot of pinches that build up. Small broken expectations over time that become big and painful. This is where the trauma happens. Now here's how churches and communities often deal with pinches and crunches. John, you won't believe how bad that preacher was and how bad his message was today. How is he going to be the lead pastor of this church? Right? Like, what's that called? Gossip. What this model suggests is that the way to health in relationships is to, well, there's a couple things. One is a quick fix. Sometimes that works. Like Sarah says, hey, honey, would you get milk when you get home on the way home? And I get home and I forgot the milk. And what do? I say, oh, hey, I'm sorry. Let me go back down to QD and I'll pick up some milk. All right, that's a quick fix. And it works in that situation. Except if she keeps asking me to get milk and I keep forgetting. All right? So then what you really have to do is you got to go back up and you have to renegotiate expectations. Honey, maybe milk, me picking things up on the way home, is not the best solution for getting things that we need. Like, we're going to have to figure out something else. And when you renegotiate expectations, everybody's expectations have to be on the table. Sometimes when I'm pinched or crunched, the problem wasn't with the other person. It was with the expectations that I brought to the situation. And I have to let those go. Now you notice there's two things here. There's two exits. There's a silent exit. This happens in churches all the time, right? Like Aunt Elda, she's not coming to church anymore. You know what people are saying? That's a silent exit. This is actually really hard for pastors because we hallucinate, like, right? This is painful. The other is a planned exit. You renegotiate expectations, but you can't come to a place where you can share a set of expectations anymore. And at its best, it's a leaving with a blessing. I had this happen one time with a couple. Thank you, John. You got your workout for the day, your arm workout. I had this a planned exit happen with a couple one time at our church. They were attending Sycamore Creek. They were attending Sycamore Creek mostly because their children and their grandchildren attended Sycamore Creek. They really preferred traditional kinds of worship. In the midst of their life in the church, their son died, or their son-in-law died, and their daughter stopped attending church, and their grandkids weren't attending anymore. So now the thing that was holding them to the church, their family and their kids, it wasn't there anymore. And they would really prefer a traditional church, except that they were really involved in all kinds of areas of leadership. So what did they do? Well, I'll tell you what, they didn't just stop showing up at meetings. They didn't just stop showing up at church. They got back together with me and they said, hey, this is the situation. We're not sure what to do. I said, you know what? Let's slowly work you out of your roles of leadership. And here's some United Methodist churches that I think would be great for you. And over a period of about 6 months, that's what happened. We slowly worked them out of their leadership roles, and they ended up going to one of those United Methodist churches that I recommended. When I see them in the grocery store, it's high fives. It's, hey, how are things going? How are your kids? How are you doing? Nothing awkward about that. I saw somebody just the other day that I had a silent exit with. It was hi, Tim. If there's any health at Sycamore Creek, it's because we manage our conflict and our relationships this way. And I learned that, not at Sycamore Creek, I learned that in the wake of a death by suicide that brought up all of the past trauma of decades being on staff at church when I turned 21, through my 20s. Now, there's a lot of awesome things that happen at Petoskey UMC, but this is one of the most significant things I brought with me about how do we spur each other on to love and good works. Fast forward to seminary. I went to Duke University. I'm a Blue Devil pastor. Go Blue Devils!
Yes.
Come on. I got two kids here in the front that are rooting with me. Sarah and I had once again the opportunity to choose our own church. It was like, we're never going to get this again. We're United Methodist pastors. We're going to be appointed by the bishop. So which church do we go to? And we were figuring, do we go to a non-United Methodist church? This is our last chance to do it. Or are we in the family, and so we're going to stick with that? And we decided, you know what, we're in the family, we're going to stick with United Methodism, but we're going to go to a different church than we've ever been to before that we'll likely be appointed to. We decided to choose the historically Black United Methodist Church in Durham. It's called Asbury United Methodist Church, led by a Black Bahamian pastor, from the Bahamas. Bahamian, yes, not Bohemian, Bahamian. Is that the right word? Anyway, he was from the Bahamas. He had a voice like James Earl Jones. I remember when I called the church and heard the answering machine, I thought, I said to Sarah, I could listen to this guy read the phone book. They wrapped their arms around us, even though we were pretty much one of the very few white people that was there. I also had the opportunity to be appointed to different internships while I was at Duke. One of them was a really fancy, big steeple, big pulpit. Like the pulpit was like where that projector is at up there. Like United Methodist Church in Richmond, Virginia, called Reveille United Methodist. While I was there, that summer, both the senior pastor and the associate pastor were both reappointed to other churches. And new pastors were appointed. I'll never forget the worship planning meeting on that first week with the new appointed pastors, when both the new lead pastor, new senior pastor, and new associate pastor weren't sure what happened in worship, and they turned to me and said, "What do they do in worship right now?" I had 5 weeks of seniority on them. I had the opportunity through that summer to watch and learn about transition. How do you leave well, and how do you come to a new church well? Later on, while I was at Duke, I was appointed in an internship to a little teeny church, Eflin United Methodist Church in Eflin, North Carolina. Eflin had a population of 700 people. It had a blinking light. That was it. And they had about 100 people in worship on Sunday morning. I mean, imagine if we had that percentage in Lansing, right? This was a small, thriving rural church. And I served under Cindy, a female pastor who was just rock solid. Except that when I first went there that Sunday, remember, I was attending at the time a Black United Methodist Church in downtown Durham, North Carolina. And when I went to visit Eflin for the first Sunday, I came home and I told Sarah, I have more in common with the Black church that we're attending than I do with this little rural church and the people. I said, I exhausted my knowledge of NASCAR and football in about 2 minutes. What's going to happen for the rest of this year in relationship with them? Well, what happened and what I learned, and this is part of why Duke appoints you to internships instead of letting you pick, is that you begin to learn that you can love people that you don't at first have an affinity for. That we are all God's people. And I'll tell you what, that last Sunday that I was there, it was a love fest. It was a love fest. Cindy, I preached a message and I got a standing ovation, and Cindy said, they've never stood and given a standing ovation to an intern before. It was an absolutely wonderful experience of trusting God with those relationships. So I graduated from Duke Divinity School. I was appointed to Sycamore Creek. This is the only church I've ever been appointed to, is Sycamore Creek. Sycamore Creek is a mother-daughter plant out of Holt United Methodist Church in the year 2000. Barb Flory, who was a rebel grandma, wanted to start a new church, and she was appointed at Holt United Methodist as a planting pastor. She gathered together a team out of Holt UMC and other United Methodist churches, about 40 people, and in 2000, November 1st of 2000, they held their first public worship service together. I was appointed 9 years later as the pastor following Barb as she retired. That's called being a second pastor. When you follow the founding pastor, and I'll tell you what, it's not an appointment that any pastor wants to have. John, you don't want to follow a founding pastor. You get chewed up really badly. I went to a second pastor's conference in my third year of being a pastor, which was about 3 years too late. And I learned a couple of things at that. One was I learned that it's not unusual for a second pastor to experience a 30 to 50% drop in attendance. You know what that did for my 20% drop? It reframed it. I only lost 20%. We didn't lose 30 to 50%. Thank you, God. We did really well. I also learned that usually a second pastor is appointed in a crisis. Our crisis was hidden because Barb was retiring rather than being reappointed somewhere else. If it was working well, usually the founding pastor stays for a very long time, but it's when it's not working well that a second pastor gets appointed in. And our crisis was a crisis of morale, a crisis of esteem. We had been shrinking for years at that point. There were these grand visions of what Sycamore Creek was going to be, and it wasn't living up to it. And I was thrown in as second pastor. I remember raising my hand and asking the leader of the teacher, I said, what's the number one talent a second pastor needs? And he said, thick skin. Thick skin. And I had pretty thick skin. But at year 2, it was enough to get me to year 3 when we launched Church in a Diner. While being the pastor at Sycamore Creek, I've led us to launch Church in a Diner, Church in a Pub. We've adopted Asbury. We're adopting Asbury after adopting Potterville UMC. We bought a building. We moved from being a suburban church into the city to being a city church. And that was a whole transition and shift. One of the things that there have been lots of ups and downs of being the pastor at Sycamore Creek, but I want to share with you and just kind of wrap up with one practice that I've done. And this is something I want to encourage you to consider practicing. I have up here with me what I call my Ebenezer Journal. Now, do you all know what the word Ebenezer is? Here I raise my Ebenezer. Look, I pulled that off. Was it okay? Did I get the tune all right? You know, we sing that line all the time, but what in the world's an Ebenezer? Like, that sounds like you got a stiff knee or something? Is that like my Ebenezer? No, Ebenezer is a reference to, those of you who grew up in Sunday school know that when Joshua led the Israelites across the Jordan River into the Promised Land, they set up stone altars, 12 stones. That was called an Ebenezer. And why did they set those stones up? It says, so that when your children say, what's that pile of stones about? It will remind you to say, the Lord did this for us. When the Philistines are attacking you, when the Canaanites are attacking you, when the Promised Land doesn't seem like much of a land that was worth being promised to, when you are surrounded by everything, look back on that Ebenezer and remember the goodness of the Lord in the past. This is one of the problems we have as regular Christians is we're really quick to be in the midst of the pain of right now and forget all of the good stuff that has happened. Sort of a negativity bias. And so when I first started at Sycamore Creek, I don't even remember where I got the idea from. It was probably at a conference. I just said, I'm going to start keeping a journal. I'm going to write down all the good things that happen so that on my bad days, I can read through it and I can remember each moment. And I got a really nice journal. And this is like the nicest journal that I could find. And I just want to read a couple of things that I've written over the years to you about the joys of being the pastor at Sycamore Creek. This was when we were launching Church in a Diner on April 30th of 2012. I just wrote down, had an awesome first launch team meeting for our new satellite team. We didn't even know that it was going to be Church in a Diner yet. So we just called it a satellite team. On October 8th of 2012, we had Grumpy's Church and a Diner launch. This was our first public launch at Grumpy's Diner. What a great place to have a church at, a place called Grumpy's Diner, right? We had 67 people and 18 first-time guests that we had never met before on October 8th of 2012. On October 4th of 2015, after we had bought the building in South Lansing and we remodeled the cafe, we had an open house party with a grand opening in our Connection Cafe. It was a huge success, hundreds of people, lots of first-time guests. Many said, in fact, I mean, this is a quote from somebody, "This was the funnest time I've had in a long time." When was the last time you went to church and said, "This is the funnest time I've had in a long time"? I wrote that down, so I didn't forget that, because not every Sunday is the funnest time you've had in a long time. On December 5th and December 6th of 2015, we painted Mount Hope STEAM School. We had 50 to 70 volunteers. We did a total facelift of the inside of the school. Tara Streeter painted a mural that was amazing. It wrote such a high. It was so awesome to improve the school right down the street from us. In March of 2016, as we were looking to do it again, the church and a diner thing, but in a pub, Buddy's Grill said yes to being our church and a pub venue. And we had moved to Jackie's Diner because Grumpy's had closed, not because of us, but Jackie's to Tuesday night and Buddy's to Monday night. Buddy's said yes for us to be doing that weekly. Yes, I wrote that down. On April 4th of 2016, Kenitha Bigum-Sai, our district superintendent, she called and she suggested that Sycamore Creek adopt Potterville UMC. I put a stone in my Ebenezer pile. On August 22nd of 2016, we had over 100 people at our second pub preview service, over 2 services, and my physical therapist came. I invited my physical therapist, who was in that same plaza, and she showed up. On December 8th of 2016, the merger vote with Potterville UMC passed. 100% Sycamore Creek, 98% Potterville. Only 1 vote against. I wrote that down. I wanted to remember that. July of 2017, great live on location at Celebration Cinema. We had 150 people and lots of first and second time guests. December of 2017, January 2018, we do a Christmas offering where we challenge the members of our church to give away as much as they spend on themselves to celebrate Christmas differently. That year, we received $22,000. Wow, thank you, God. And then later on, I had to update it because the number increased to 24,000. This is a testament to God's goodness through these 13 years that I've been a pastor at Sycamore Creek. What are the stones that we're going to place in the future of this being a campus of Sycamore Creek? What are the things that we're going to have to renegotiate? Where are the pinches and the crunches that are going to come? How are we going to put our expectations on the table with open hands, ready to see what new thing God is going to do? How are we going to break the cycle of past trauma and pain for a new thriving future? What are going to be our stories from this point forward? I'm going to be writing them down in my journal. I hope you will too. Would you let me pray for us? God, as we enter into this sort of new season of life as a church, come July 1st, where this becomes a campus of Sycamore Creek, and we take a year to close things and remodel and reconstitute and relaunch. God, I know there's a lot of anxiety about that. I know there is, because there's anxiety in my heart and mind as well. But God, you have been good in the past, even when it was hard, and we trust that you will be good in the future. Help us remember your goodness and faithfulness. In the name of Jesus and the power of your Spirit. And all who agreed said, Amen.